Is the Anglo-Saxon invasion of England a myth? If you're like me, growing up in England, you were taught that it was just that, but it seems we might have been wrong. It's because if recent DNA testing is to be believed, then an invader who fought against the Anglo-Saxons has more claim to being British than the Anglo-Saxons themselves. And to prove it, here are 7 facts about the real Anglo-Saxon invasion of Britain. Welcome to the channel. Now, the idea that the British were originally descended from invaders from Germany is a fairly recent one. In fact, the idea of the Anglo-Saxon invasion only really started taking hold during the 18th century when antiquarians started to dig up the past. Although antiquarians is probably too kind a word for these amateur archaeologists who often simply stole artifacts from their sites, most notably the infamous boot. In the 18th century, scholars such as William Camden and Samuel Bandley proposed that early medieval England was actually made up of 3 separate kingdoms: the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. This theory was further developed by the 19th century archaeologist John Latham, who proposed that each of these groups had migrated to England from their own homeland in northern Germany. It wasn't until the late 20th century, however, this theory really took hold thanks to the work of historian N.J. Hayam. You see, since the 1970s, archaeologists had uncovered evidence of a mass migration into Britain around the 5th century A.D., a period known as the Late Roman or Post-Roman period. At first, they thought this migration was made up of Anglo-Saxons. Then in 1975, archaeologists discovered the Ringlemere Bronze Age burial in Kent, which contained a variety of Germanic artifacts, including a drinking horn with Germanic inscriptions. Archaeologists also discovered a few other similar burials across the south of England. And so the idea of the Anglo-Saxon takeover was born. Now, Hayam's theory differed slightly from his predecessors in that he argued that the Anglo-Saxons were the only ones migrating to Britain at this time. He also proposed that Germanic tribes from what is today Denmark and northern Germany arrived at the same time. The problem was, there was very little archaeological evidence to back up this theory, because the people who lived there at the time didn't leave behind any written records. Instead, we have things like place names and personal names, as well as a smattering of archaeological evidence that suggests that these groups were here. But unfortunately, it's not much to go on. So how do we know that they were here? Well, for that we turn to bones. That's right. One of the main pieces of evidence for the Anglo-Saxon invasion comes from bones. See, archaeology is more than just finding cool artifacts. It's also about finding human remains. From human remains, we can get all kinds of information, such as diet, lifestyle, and diseases. We can even use them to determine where someone was from. How do we do that? Well, back in the 1960s and 70s, archaeologists excavated several cemeteries in eastern England. Some of these cemeteries contained skeletons of people who died between the 4th and 7th centuries AD. When scientists analyzed the skeletons, they found that the people buried in these cemeteries seemed to have come from continental Europe. More specifically, they came from areas that today are known as Denmark and northern Germany. But perhaps even more interestingly, scientists found that the population of eastern England changed dramatically after the 5th century. Before the 5th century, people living in eastern England looked a lot like, well, other people living in Britain. After the 5th century, however, suddenly the population was made up of tall, broad-shouldered men with narrow hips and long skulls. These physical characteristics are all typical of people from northern Germany and Denmark today. But back then, they weren't British. So, yeah, it looks like an invasion did take place. But the question is, was it an invasion? You see, despite what historians have named the Anglo-Saxon invasion, there's no evidence that it involved armies marching across the North Sea to conquer new lands. Instead, it seems to have been more of a gradual process. Here's how it probably went down. During the late Roman period, the Roman army withdrew from Britain, leaving a power vacuum. Various Germanic tribes took advantage of this and began migrating to Britain. As they moved in, they encountered the native Britons and fought against them, pushing them further west. Over time, they absorbed the Britons, either through intermarriage or simply killing them. By the end of the 7th century, they had taken control of most of eastern and southern England. Unfortunately for them, though, the native Britons were able to hold out in the west, forming what we today call Cornwall, Devon, Somerset, Dorset, Hampshire, and the Isle of Wight. Even more unfortunately for them, Though over the next few hundred years, the Anglo-Saxons would push them all the way into the mountains of Wales and Cornwall, where they live today. Now, while the Anglo-Saxons were certainly brutal, it doesn't seem that they were bloodthirsty. For example, one thing that we notice about the Anglo-Saxon invasion is that it seems to have happened pretty quickly. Between the 5th and 7th centuries, most of England was under Anglo-Saxon rule. Yet in all that time, there's not a single archaeological site that shows signs of widespread violence. Not a single village seems to have been burnt to the ground. Towns and villages were simply abandoned as people moved west. That suggests that the Anglo-Saxons didn't invade in the traditional sense. They didn't march across the North Sea with a large army to conquer Britain. Instead, it seems that they simply took advantage of the chaos that followed the Romans' withdrawal. Still, we can't deny that they were invaders. So the question is, how did they get to England in the first place? Well, for that, we turn to one of the most famous figures in British history, King Arthur. Or maybe we shouldn't. You see, according to legend, King Arthur was the king of Britain in the 5th or 6th century AD. He's best known for the battles of Badon, Kemlon, and of course, the Battle of Camlon. It's this battle that seems to be the key to understanding the Anglo-Saxon invasion. You see, according to the English historian Gildas, Arthur was a war leader who led the Britons to victory against the invading Saxons at the Battle of Badon. However, unlike most stories about Arthur, this story is almost certainly true. It's because it's mentioned by an independent source, the Welsh cleric Nennius, in his book Historia Brittonum. And it's not just that these sources mention Arthur. It's that they mention him fighting the Saxons in the late 5th century. That fits perfectly with what we know about the Anglo-Saxon invasion. According to these accounts, Arthur was a British king who defended his people against invading Germanic tribes. But if Arthur was a British king, why are we celebrating St. George's Day instead of, say, St. Arthur's Day? Well, for that, we can thank one man, Geoffrey of Monmouth. In 1136, Geoffrey published the History of the Kings of Britain, a book that created the legends of King Arthur. From that point on, Arthur became synonymous with the Middle Ages and Britain, and by extension, England. But now that we know that the Anglo-Saxons invaded Britain in the 5th century, does that mean that Arthur didn't exist? Well, possibly. We'll never know for sure. But I think it's safe to say that the historical Arthur was very different from the legendary one. Instead of being a great warrior king, he was probably just a local warlord who fought against the invaders. That begs the question, though, what happened to him? Did he die at Camlon? Well, again, the answer is probably not. According to legend, after Camlon, Arthur was mortally wounded and taken to Avalon to heal. But there's no evidence that he ever died. In fact, in some versions of the legend, he never even went to Avalon. Instead, he faked his death, went to live in France, and then returned to Britain in disguise to defeat the Saxons once and for all. The reality, however, was probably a lot less exciting. It's quite possible that Arthur died at Camlon or some other battle. But equally, it's possible that he lived out his days as a farmer in Wales. Unfortunately, the truth is that we simply don't know. The only sources we have are either too late or simply too legendary to be of any real help. What we do know is that by the 10th century, the Anglo-Saxons controlled all of England except for a few small areas in Wales and Cornwall. They would not last long, however. By the 11th century, the English kings were marching into Wales, and the Anglo-Saxon era was at an end. So there you have it, the real Anglo-Saxon invasion of England. Do you think Arthur was a real historical figure? If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more fascinating content like this. Your support really helps the channel growth. Thank you.